Today, I'd like to welcome you to Sustainable Energy Hawaii's weekly Pau Hana. For those who are new, we are a grassroots group, an organization dedicated to improving the quality of life for our Big Island residents. We're especially focused on enabling affordable energy, that which is produced using only local renewable energy sources. My name is Noel Marin. I'm one of the board members for the organization. We have several of us here today. And I'm especially pleased to kick off our presentation today as we're going to be discussing a very important topic, our groundwater resources. We'll have some time at the end of Dr. Thomas's presentation for questions. So we'll just hold off until then. With this, I'd like to now turn this over to Richard, who is going to be introducing our guest.
Yeah, thanks, Noel. Dr. Thomas is a member of the faculty of the Hawaii Institute of Geophysics and Planetology at the Manoa, and serves as director of the Center for the Study of Active Volcanoes at the University of Hawaii at Hilo. He completed his doctoral studies at the University of Hawaii in 1977 with a focus on the hydrology and geochemistry of the volcanic and hydrothermal systems of Kilauea. That's everybody knows who Don Thomas is. He's been around for a long time, and I've known him for a long time. He's a top shape guy. Anyway, take it away, Don.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I will share my screen, and I have a PowerPoint presentation. I hope you'll find it interesting. When I was talking with Richard sort of about some of the things that some of the projects I've been involved in here in Hawaii, and I guess what triggered it was I told Richard that I know that in Hawaii we've drilled about 4,500 wells, and you would think after 4,500 wells that we'd know just about everything we needed to know about groundwater in Hawaii. And of those 4,500, I can claim credit for 4 or 5 wells that I've drilled. And every single well that I've drilled, we've encountered something fundamentally different from what we understood the groundwater resource to be doing here in Hawaii. So Richard asked me if I would talk about this and why it was so frequently that I had come up with unexpected information. And I guess first off, I'll ask a question. When is the discussion of groundwater not boring? Because not very many people will sit down and talk with me about groundwater. But the answer is when you don't have enough of it. And unfortunately, we seem not to worry about water as long as it's coming out of our tap. But I like to cite kind of the saying that supposedly originated in the Old West: whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting over. And Hawaii is well into that now. Every time somebody wants to develop water, there's always somebody there that wants to argue that that water shouldn't be used. And I like to say that part of the reason that I've been surprised so many times is that I drill wells in places that nobody else is stupid enough to drill. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about what our conventional understanding is for groundwater, and then walk us through some of the drilling projects and some of the findings that we've made from that work. So our standard conceptual model for ocean island hydrology is kind of this little cartoon here. Let me see if I can bring up a laser. Can I do that? Not sure if you can see my cursor, I guess I'll have to use that. But the basic idea is that we have rainfall that falls on the island. It infiltrates down through the overlying rock and eventually gets down to near sea level, where we have a saturated zone, and that fresh water will accumulate and then gradually flow out to the ocean. And if water builds up to any elevation above sea level within the island, we displace fresh groundwater downward because of the density difference between fresh and salt water. And this isn't a pool of water. I know a lot of people visualize it in that way, but it's really rock that is saturated with water. Whatever pukas that we have in the rock, they are filled with either fresh water or salt water once we get down to this water table. So our sort of concept of groundwater in volcanic ocean islands does recognize some of the geology that we see. And this is a model that something you've undoubtedly seen something very similar to this when we've talked about groundwater in Hawaii. And this is kind of a cartoon of the island of Hawaii, the island of Oahu. And here in sort of the center of Oahu, we have Ko'olau mountain. Actually, it's the rift zone of Ko'olau volcano that has many dikes. And dikes are volcanic features where magma has been injected underground under very high pressure. And it cools in place. It's very dense. And it has the porosity and the permeability of concrete. It's very dense material. And it does a very good job of trapping water within, we call this a dike complex. But out on the flanks of the volcano, the rock is very, very porous. Hawaii is kind of unique in comparison to the other states on the continent. The rock there is a lot less porous, and some of our wells, and especially on the Big Island, we can drill a well and start pumping on it. We'll get 10 or 20 times the water that a conventional well on the mainland produce. And that's because our rocks are very, very porous. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But the general idea is that very porous and permeable rock, whatever rainfall comes in, flows out towards the shoreline and then discharges to the ocean. And these models that we have today are based mostly on the work that was done by Stearns and McDonald starting in the 1930s. And Stearns and McDonald were a couple of geologists. Stearns was actually in the private sector. Gordon McDonald worked for USGS and then actually became a faculty member at the University of Hawaii. And sort of one of the most, I guess, fortunate events of my career was I actually took a class with Gordon McDonald. He's the one that introduced me to the geology of Hawaii. And their work, they did a tremendous amount of work, and they did reports, and they were published by the Territory of Hawaii. And they're all titled The Geology and Groundwater Resources of an Island, of Oahu, of Kauai, of Hawaii. And they compiled all that we knew at the time about the hydrogeology of the island. This was taken from the Geology and Groundwater Resources of Maui. This was published in 1935. And this is intended to depict what a cross-section of the island looks like, where we have rainfall recharge coming in, infiltrating on the flank lavas down to a fairly thin freshwater lens and migrating to the ocean, and of course the dike complex in the interior. And likewise, in the older islands, you have erosion cutting valleys in, and sometimes those dikes are exposed, and you'll have spring-fed or dike-fed springs that generate streams that then travel towards the ocean while losing water down into that water table. But the common denominator here is that this freshwater layer is always assumed to be fairly thin, and the rate of increase in the elevation at the top of this water table, I always heard was estimated at about 1 foot per mile as you go inland. And for every 1 foot above sea level, you'd have 40 feet of fresh water below sea level accumulating in this so-called basal lens. But that still tells us that, that's a fairly small volume of fresh water available. And that those concepts for groundwater in Hawaii are still very heavily used in our management of groundwater resources. So we have this concept of sustainable yield, where the Commission on Water Resources Management, and I'll show you a map in a minute, they estimate the total volume of water that is entering into a section of the island. And as a general policy, they say you can withdraw no more than 40% of that infiltration volume in order to use for agriculture, domestic consumption, whatever. And so they reserve 60% of that total volume to allow it to actually discharge along the shoreline. And the reason for that, and there is a very good reason it is that this fresh groundwater carries nutrients into the nearshore environment and supports the nearshore ecosystem. It provides some essential nutrients that are not present in the shallow ocean water that allows the fish and seaweed and everything, that whole ecosystem to exist. So they have a sustainable yield. And this is the big island, and they have, not quite in ahupua'as, but the concept is there. They've subdivided the island into these different sectors. The East Mauna Kea aquifer sector, as they call it, that sustainable yield has been estimated at about 388 million gallons per day. And that's about 40% of the total estimated recharge that comes into this section of Mauna Kea. The East Mauna Loa, that number is 740 million gallons a day. Those are big numbers. You get over here on the leeward side of the island, though, and the numbers get a lot smaller. In the Kiholo and the Hualalai aquifer sector, which consists of Kiholo and Keho, totals about 56 million gallons per day. So this is how groundwater is regulated. For those of you, and hopefully I'm not going too deep into the weeds, but the way groundwater is regulated in Hawaii is a fairly complex scheme, but the landowner does have access to it, but the Commission on Water Resources Management does have management authority over that water that will allow you to withdraw some of that water, but not so much that you adversely impact other prospective users that are occupying sort of that same aquifer sector. And so this is an important function, and we need to get that right. So in the work that I'm going to talk about, some of this fairly recent stuff, and I'm getting pretty old myself, so recent for me is still 20 odd years ago. But I'm going to be talking about some of the projects that I have done that validate some aspects of this model, but also shows some of them that shows that we don't really have a complete understanding. So the first project that we did that really kind of opened my eyes was the Hawaii Scientific Drilling Project. That actually started back in the early 90s. And we drilled a couple of boreholes right here in Hilo near the shoreline. And what we were doing was basic science, not of any serious interest to anybody in the state. We really were trying to understand the history of what we call a mantle plume volcano. Hawaii has unique volcanism. It's been referred to in various ways, mid-plate volcanism. It's very different from the volcanism that occurs on the continental margins. And at the time, we didn't have really anywhere near a complete understanding of that type of volcanism. So the objective of our project was to look at the chemical compositions of the lavas from Mauna Kea and see how they change over a significant section of the life of Mauna Kea. and see if we could learn something about this planetary process, this mantle plume, or so-called Hawaiian hotspot, that is responsible for Hawaii. So we were also going to determine the accumulation rate or growth rate of a Hawaiian volcano, because we didn't really know what that was. And in fact, I should say that we really accomplished many of these goals. We did document, say, the first half or last 500,000 years of the life of Mauna Kea, and saw a number of interesting changes going on in the chemistry of the lava. We actually completely revised the estimated age for the Big Island's volcanoes. They're not 500,000 years. Mauna Kea is more like 1.5 million years. And we wanted to document the underlying structure of the island, because nobody had ever drilled to this deep. And in fact, this hole is the deepest hole ever drilled into an ocean island volcano. And I guess I have to say that I kind of became an accidental hydrologist, because we were fully expecting the groundwater results to be entirely boring. Because the model we were looking at was this same model that we had in 1935, and we were going to be drilling here on the windward edge of Mauna Kea volcano, actually on Mauna Loa, where Mauna Loa encroaches on Mauna Kea, but I'll talk about that. We figured we would drill through the freshwater layer into salt water, and then we would be in salt water for as deep as we cared to drill. So, a few things we knew about groundwater on Hawaii Island: very permeable, recent lava, allows rainfall to recharge rapidly, goes into the basal lands, and flows very quickly out of the island. Because of the ease of flow, the water is very young. Unlike Oahu, Hawaii Island is too young to have a cap rock, and therefore there's no chance that we would have artesian water on the Big Island. Now, one of the other things that we did that was unique in this project was that we used a different type of drilling technology. Conventional drilling uses a bit that looks something like this, only about 5 or 6 times larger. This is about a 3.5-inch diameter bit. And it's a so-called tricone bit. And its function is to grind up the rock and get it out of the way. Because most water well drillers, they want the hole. They're not interested in the rock. Grind it up, get it out of here. In contrast, we were interested in the rock, and we wanted a continuous sequence of samples of rock. So we used these kinds of bits here that are so-called diamond matrix bits. They're cookie cutters. They rotate and grind away the rock, and they leave us with this central core that comes up into the drill string. And inside that drill string, we've got a core tube that receives that core, and we can hoist that to the surface and unload it. And we have then a complete geologic record of the lava flows that we've drilled through. And what we did is we sectioned this, and basically we have a detailed record of the volcanic history of every single lava flow that has crossed this spot, going back something over 500,000 years. And so the borehole is located right down here. It was on Mauna Loa, but it's in an area where Mauna Loa encroaches on Mauna Kea. We know that Mauna Kea is just below, Mauna Loa is just, Mauna Kea is just below Mauna Loa at this location. And so we were drilling initially through Mauna Loa lavas over about 1,000 feet before we hit Mauna Kea. And again, I like to show this image to make the point that, we're familiar with these volcanoes, but in fact, there's more of the volcano underwater than there is above water. And here we can see sort of the flank of Mauna Kea kind of reaches out to here. Mauna Loa is actually coming in and encroaching on Mauna Kea. And this is the boundary of the surface lava flows from Mauna Loa building on the flank of Mauna Kea. So I'm going to show you some pictures of rocks, because it turns out they're fairly important. This is sort of what I refer to as garden variety Pahoehoe lava. You can see all the vesicles, the pukas. This is a very gas-rich lava flow lots of pukas, lots of fractures. This is what an lava flow looks like. And I was saying earlier that, we can get 10 times the production from some of our wells that we can on the mainland. And that's because we have layers of this so-called clinker material. It's very rough, very open, and very rubbly, and it allows water to flow very, very rapidly. And that's actually how water flows within our rocks. And we pass through the fresh water of Mauna Loa, basal lens of that fresh lens into salt water. But then as we approached the bottom of the Mauna Loa interval of rocks, we ran into this stuff. And this is soil and ash that were deposited because there were very infrequent lava flows. We were then at a period when Mauna Kea was erupting fairly infrequently. And so we got a lot of ash accumulation. It turns out this material doesn't allow water to flow very well. And right at the boundary, we found a very thick section. This is Mauna Loa rocks into Mauna Kea, very thick section of ash. And when we drilled through that layer of ash, we encountered a second freshwater aquifer. Now this, there is no textbook that shows this in an ocean island, a second freshwater aquifer down below salt water. So this was a brand new finding. And the depth of that, the top of that fresh water was sitting underneath those ash layers, and it's about 400 meters deep, about 1,200 meters down. And when we drilled into it, the well started to produce, and we were getting 2,100 gallons a minute. This is about as much fresh water as Hilo was using at the time, about 3 million gallons a day, spontaneously flowing out of the well. So we in that one fell swoop, we kind of blew up a big piece of the model of groundwater hydrology for this island. Now I'm going to get a little bit into the weeds here. The isotopic composition of that artesian water, and it turns out that water is a very interesting substance. We have, it's H2O, everybody knows that. But it turns out oxygen has a light and a heavy isotope. Hydrogen has a light and a heavy isotope. And it turns out that when you evaporate water and when you condense water, you change the isotopic composition of the water in the clouds and in the rainfall. And that isotopic composition changes as that rainfall moves higher and higher on the mountain. So this is an internal tracer. I can go out anywhere on the island and sample the water from a well, and I compare that to a isotope ratio to elevation plot, and I can tell you where that water hit the ground, at what elevation that water hit the ground on Mauna Kea or Mauna Loa. That's due to the good work of some of the USGS folks. They went to the effort of setting out a sequence of buckets starting at sea level all the way up to the summit of Mauna Loa and collected rainfall over a couple of years to determine what that isotope versus elevation relationship was. So that allowed me then to say that the groundwater I was seeing, that fresh water I was seeing in that deep aquifer came from about 2,000 meters or 7,000 foot elevation on Mauna Kea. We also found that the age of that water, I was able to extract the CO2 and do a carbon-14 date on the water. Turned out it was about 2,000 years. So we've blown up something else that we thought we knew, that we only have young water moving very rapidly through the basal aquifer and discharging into the ocean. So this water that we see infiltrated about 2,000 years ago into the flank of Mauna Kea, migrated down into the interior of Mauna Kea, and then flowed out towards the shoreline. So Based on the thickness of that layer of fresh water, the age and the distance traveled, and this is a crude estimate at best, but we figure about 200 million gallons a day of fresh water is being discharged into the ocean at about 1,000 to 1,500 feet below sea level. And it turns out we know that that's happening because deep submersibles have actually found freshwater discharges offshore in the Hilo Bay, or offshore of Hilo Bay on Hawaii Island. So this is an active system. It's being continuously recharged and continually discharged. This is kind of a cartoon of what we saw, where this is the Mauna Loa basal system, the underlying salt water. These confining layers, that's what we refer to these ash layers as, confining layers, with this fresh water below and discharging offshore. And I'm really burning up my time, so I better keep moving here. As we continue drilling the hole deeper, we found some additional formations that were acting as confining formations. Now, this is what our lava flows look like. When we got into the submarine lavas, this is what they initially looked like. And these are lavas that are generated when the lava flow goes into the ocean and kind of blows itself apart and turns itself into fragments. We kept drilling into that. Well, this is just kind of what we saw in Puna during the Pu'uo eruptions, same material. But as we drilled deeper, this material became compacted and cemented together by weathering processes, and it turned out very little water flow occurred in this section of the borehole, whereas there was lots and lots of water flowing through the very broken up stuff. And then we hit this material, which is pillow lavas. These pillow lavas are formed when a lava flow is generated deep underwater. You don't get that explosive reaction, and the flow will form a very dense type of lava, but it's highly fractured. And it turned out there's water flow through these pillow lavas. And this is a cartoon of what we were drilling into. We had these tongues of pillows that were essentially totally surrounded by this indurated hyaloclastite, that cemented fragmental material. And of course, a big surprise was that this was under pressure. This is taken at a rig floor. The drillers have the drill hands have just disconnected the drill head, and they're getting ready to put another piece of pipe on to continue drilling. And every time they did this, they got a bath. And that was kind of a surprise to us. But the bigger surprise was that this was fresh water. And we found this type of system in most of the pillow intervals. At one point, we had continuous sequence of casing from the surface down to 9,800 feet. When we induced the well to flow, we got fresh water coming from 10,000 feet below sea level. There's no textbook on the planet that would ever have dared postulate fresh water getting that deep inside the island. So this really has turned our understanding of groundwater within the island on its head. The whole base of the island, or the individual bases of the volcanoes, because of their structure, seem to have an ability to trap and store fresh water at least to 10,000 feet. And in fact, the pressure that we encountered in this well, when we put a pressure gauge on the top of our casing early on in the flow, and we got about 150 pounds per square inch of hydrostatic pressure. So with those pressures, we probably have freshwater saturation extending all the way down to the old sea floor, which is at about 20,000 feet now. So this is our conceptual model for groundwater within the deep flank of Mauna Kea. These tongues are saturated with fresh water. We did also see some zones where we had hypersaline water. where the water actually had been down there so long it had reacted with the rocks. And one of the first reactions actually pulls H2O out of the water to hydrate the glass in those pillow lavas, leaving a hyperconcentrated and chemically altered, essentially connate water is the term that we use. But the thing we didn't see ever in these deep lavas was actually seawater. So it seems that the base of the island has excluded seawater from it. Now, to get water, fresh water 10,000 feet down, that told us that we have to have fresh water above sea level. There has to be hydrostatic head sufficient to displace seawater to those depths. And so that told us that we had to have more fresh water above sea level than the old models anticipated. And the old models, this is again from an old Stearns and McDonald report, and even going through Humu'ula, they estimated that no more than 100 feet or so of fresh water would accumulate at the interior of the island. So we wanted to test that, and we conducted some geophysical surveys. And these are, I'm not going to get into the weeds here, but there's a method that we can actually look downward in the ground and measure the electrical conductivity of the rock. It's a very simple concept. Dry rock is a lot less conductive, electrically conductive, than wet rock. And so we're able to see down actually as deep as 20 kilometers inside the island. And what we found, this is a cross section along the survey. Our first station we located right near a known well, the Saddle Road well. It's at an elevation of a couple of thousand feet above sea level, where we know we actually have fresh water standing about 1,000 feet above sea level. But this gave us the electrical resistivity, is the term we use, of Mauna Kea rocks saturated with fresh water. And that's between 600 and 1,000 ohm meters is the term we use. Now, these rocks up here, the warm colors, these rocks had a resistivity of around 30,000 ohm meters. So about 30 times what freshwater saturated rock looks like with this method. So clearly there's some dry rock there, but what we found is that both in this location and in this location, we had zones where we had rock with resistivity similar to freshwater saturated Mauna Kea basalt, rising up to within a few hundred meters of the ground surface. And so with that data, we were able to get funding to drill an exploration hole up here at the PTA cantonment. That's, as it turned out, the location where it looked like we had the highest elevation fresh water within the flank of Mauna Kea through this area survey. Now, what we found was the shallow interval was dry as expected, but even I was surprised that about 700 feet, we hit a layer of saturation where we had a stable water table. And I was scratching my head the whole time because I couldn't imagine, how we could have water that high. But it turned out that was a perched aquifer. It extended 500 feet down to 1,200 feet, but we drilled through a perching formation, and I was equally surprised. This appears to be that perching formation. This sort of brick-like texture tells us there's a lot of clay in this material, and that seems to be what was holding up that body of water, because when we drilled through it, the water went away. But we continued drilling, and we got down to about 1,800 feet where we hit another saturated layer, and that layer held steady until we quit drilling at about 5,786 feet down. But that 1,800 feet is essentially a standing water table 4,600 feet above sea level, not 200 feet, but 4,600 feet. So that's telling us that we have a much larger body of water within Mauna Kea, certainly within those saddle lavas, than anybody had estimated. And my kind of concept of this body that we drilled through, this is our perched layer here, which is fairly small. But then this deeper zone, based on the resistivity, extends over a pretty good section of the saddle. And I would kind of say, if I was going to drill a water well up here, I would drill it somewhere within this kind of blue patch. And I know I'm way short on time. I apologize for that, but I'm going to keep going. We wanted to let me a few more details. The water in that aquifer isotopically comes from about 3,000 meters, about 9,000 feet on Mauna Kea. Age of the water is about 5,000 years. And this water appears to have been stored up there for quite a while. Based on the nature of the core, this regional aquifer, at least on one side, may be dike, what we call dike impounded. We did see some dikes. And one of the bigger surprises, which is also, I'm sure, going to be of interest to you, temperature gradient in the hole also supports the idea that there have been some intrusive volcanism in this region. As we were drilling, we noticed one morning that the core is drying out awfully fast, and we reached out to touch it. It turned out it was warm. Big surprise to us. And this is a temperature measurement we made with depth going down the hole. And we actually had to stop drilling at 5,786 feet because the temperature got to 100 degrees Celsius, to the boiling point. And because we had a water exploration permit and not a geothermal exploration permit, we decided it was prudent to stop at that point. But the temperature gradient in the hole is about 165 degrees Celsius per kilometer. So drilling another kilometer from the bottom of this hole, we would be at about the temperature of some of the PGV wells. And again, a surprise because, I did the first geothermal assessment here in Hawaii for the whole state. This never came close to being on our radar. We never even thought, gave a second thought that this area might have a thermal resource associated with it. But very clearly it does. So based on that first hole, we wanted to test the western extent of that freshwater resource. So we drilled a second hole over here to see actually if we could strike this western flank of the conductive anomaly. But we had to move a little further west over to the Kemuku parcel that the Army purchased from Parker Ranch some years back. A little farther than I wanted to go, but we needed to drill the hole on Army land. State land would have put me in a 5-year permitting cycle. And there, what we found was something completely different, but no less interesting. Instead of, just drilling through one or two perched aquifers, we actually drilled through a whole sequence of confined aquifers. And I'll explain that in a minute. So this red line represents the depth of our hole as we were drilling. These blue vertical lines and X's here are intended to depict the water level in the hole as we were drilling. So for the first month or so of drilling, we were drilling in a dry hole, no sign of water. We got down to about 1,050 feet. All of a sudden, we actually had water coming up at us. We drilled through some kind of a capping formation, and water started flowing up our drill string and rose actually 600 feet in our drill string. So this is a artesian aquifer that we drilled into. We continued drilling for a couple of days and apparently drilled through the bottom of that. And the water went away. We kept drilling. We got down here to about 1,800 feet and again saw water. And through the balance of the hole, what we saw was water levels rising and falling as we drilled through this sequence of pressurized aquifers. And this was something that nobody anticipated. This was completely that I didn't anticipate and didn't know anybody else was expecting it, but I got an interesting story on that too. The confining layers are mostly ash and clay intervals, as well as some explosion deposits. More rock pictures. You can see, again, this brick texture indicates a high content of clay in the formation. And where we saw water levels rising, we always found a layer of this material that was not very permeable for water. And in one case, this was a particularly interesting sequence. We have a continuous sequence from over here, through here, all the way down to here, that had about a 1500 psi hydrostatic head behind it. And if you look carefully, I mean, you can see that there's different types of rocks. This is an enlargement of some of this stuff. These fragments, angular fragments embedded in ash, tell us that this was one hell of an explosion. This is an explosion deposit. And it put about 15 feet of material over this area. So there was some kind of a massive explosion. And that layer was right here when we drilled through this interval here. So really the bottom line of the story is that, these different types of activity from Mauna Kea have put different layers, very different layers within what we call the stratigraphic sequence. And these things are very significant in controlling how water flows. And I think in simple cartoons, but this is how I think of the situation. We have the permeable lavas here in these tan layers. These red layers are these impermeable layers that water is able to infiltrate into these zones. It gets trapped into these zones and moves through them. Now, they are going to be at differing pressures. They're not absolutely watertight. There's undoubtedly some exchange and flow back and forth. But in thinking about, how this water may be stored in these layers, it may be that they're just pockets and very limited volume, not tremendously interesting. They can be other pockets that are simply dumping water into the basal lens that then flows towards the shoreline and discharges. But some of these layers may be sufficiently dense and impermeable that they extend down into the salt water, underlying salt water in the flanks of the volcanoes and discharge there, or possibly even completely bypass the basal lens and discharge into the deep ocean, similar to what we saw in Hilo. So we saw in Hilo a phenomenon that now we've seen evidence for up on the west flank of the saddle. And again, I'm going to try not to run too much over time. Question is, do we see more evidence? And in fact, we do. Some of the water that we've sampled down here on the shoreline, isotopically, looks like rainfall that occurs at about 10 or 12,000 feet on Mauna Kea, without any mixing with other rainfall on its way down the mountain. So that tells me that this water that's being discharged here somehow has been protected from mixing with lower elevation groundwater. But a particularly interesting area that we've done quite a bit of work in now, and to me is very exciting, is this area over here, the Keho Aquifer. And the Kona groundwater used to have a reputation of being pretty awful, because the basal groundwater here, the lens is very thin. It very quickly goes saline, and in days past, you could guarantee that whatever drinking water you had available tasted pretty awful. Until some brave soul went up slope and drilled up above the Mamalahoa Highway, and what do you know? They found groundwater elevation there extending as high as 200 feet above sea level. And that water was very good quality as compared to this 1 or 2 feet above sea level down here in the basal lens. And the USGS interpreted this, oh, well, this must be dike impounded water. I did some work over there and elected to get into a dogfight with them because the isotope chemistry told me that no, this isn't dike impounded water. The age of the water told me no, this is not dike impounded water. And as it turned out, the isotope said that this water actually doesn't come from Hualalai. The isotopes say that it has to come from an elevation even higher than Hualalai. It has to be coming from Mauna Loa. And you're not going to have Mauna Loa water in a dike impounded system on the flank of Hualalai. And we had a pretty strong hint of this from several wells that I'm going to talk about here. There was one well that was drilled down below the high level. This is a so-called high level aquifer. They drilled below the high level aquifer, and it was a monitoring well that Commission on Water Resources Management drilled. And what they found was, this is the conductivity curve. They found water that was strongly artesian. They drilled to about 600 feet below sea level. Now, this is an area where we expected to see water only a couple of feet above sea level, but they had tremendous upflow in their well in 25 feet ahead in their monitoring well. And that told us this is not a conventional basal groundwater well at all. So Tom Nance drilled a second well over here, the Kamakana well. In that one, when while he was drilling, he was looking for this deep freshwater aquifer. And he initially found a very saline, thin basal end, saline water down to 950 feet. This is a conductivity survey that he did in the well when the well was 950 feet down. He continued drilling. He didn't give up. He got down to 1,050 feet, and at 1,100 feet, he did another conductivity survey and found that the water down here was fresh, below 1,050 feet. But as he continued drilling, he hit more salt water, and finally he threw in the towel and said, okay, well, this is really too thin for us to be much interested. But the Commission on Water Resources Management drilled another monitoring well. They're in the process of finishing that right now. It's the Koloko Deep Monitoring Well. And initially, this is what they saw in the salinity or the conductivity of the water. It was very saline. It wasn't as high as seawater, though. And down to, in this case, they were about 350 feet below sea level when this survey was done. But they were never say die, so they kept drilling. And they drilled down almost to 1,100 feet. And what we saw is the salinity dropped to kind of brackish water at about 450 feet below the groundwater table. But at 950 feet, the salinity of the water fell down into about 150 parts per thousand, which is excellent quality drinking water. So it turns out then that Tom Nance should have kept drilling, number one. But number two, it looks as though we have good evidence anyway that there is a deep freshwater aquifer buried within the flank of Hualalai. And it's my thesis that fresh water is actually discharging as deep freshwater discharge well below sea level, 1,500 feet below sea level, offshore of Hualalai. And what we did to test that, we did some offshore geophysical surveys where we did something similar to what we did on land, and we could tell how saline the water was within the basalts below the seabed. And we ran some surveys. This was work, the lead on this was Eric Atias, one of the postdocs at the University of Hawaii. Above Nelha out towards Kiholo Bay and then down south beyond Kailua Kona. Now, what I'm going to talk about is the line 3 north and the line 2 south. The line 3 north, what he found was this very conductive seawater saturated layer, but within that or below that was a more resistive layer, and indicating that we had freshened water, if not completely fresh water, another layer of seawater saturated rock, and then very likely more fresh water below. In the line 3 south, we found, again, freshwater saturated rock, but then going to nearly completely fresh at a depth of about 300 meters below sea level, or about 1,000 feet below sea level, and extending at least to 1,500 feet below sea level. And we believe that this reservoir of fresh water extends all the way back under that west flank of Hualalai. This is kind of our cartoon for that. With these multiple layers, they're confined and they are flowing out and discharging offshore. So this is our conceptual model for the groundwater within that southwest flank of Hualalai. So, what are the implications? It's a good news, bad news story. There's a heck of a lot more water inside the island than we thought. Some of that water, though, is bypassing the recognized aquifers. Again, I go back to this whole business of sustainable yield. If we got water bypassing, then seaworm, the way they're regulating the water, runs the risk of actually overdrawing on these shallow aquifers. And so they kind of need to rethink how they're going to go about managing this groundwater system so they don't do that. And this, again, is a cartoon. They're thinking that all the freshwater recharge is passing through this area. And we're saying, nope, there's some of this water bypassing. We need to rethink how we regulate water use, because that sustainable yield assumes that all that water is mixing. And actually what we found is that the deep freshwater aquifer is actually coming from a different aquifer unit. Again, I go back to that map. We've got the Kehoe aquifer, 35 million or 38 million gallons a day is what the sustainable yield is. But the isotope data tells us that actually that deep aquifer is deriving water from the Kealakekua aquifer sector. So if they're going to regulate groundwater withdrawal, they need to basically look at not a map, but look at the isotopic composition and try to determine where that water is coming from. So the picture is a lot more complicated. And I guess legitimately the question that I can ask is, okay, is it unique to the southwest flank of Hualalai? In fact, it isn't. We have evidence that their freshwater seeps about 10 kilometers offshore of Kiholo Bay. And if there's fresh water there, that means that we've got a freshwater aquifer flowing below this flank of Hualalai, Mauna Kea, Kohala. Whoop, let's see. I screwed up. Give me a second. I'm going to have to get rid of. Okay, let me get back to my talking. So, another question: Are these geologic structures responsible to deep aquifers unique to Hawaii Island? No, they're not. We actually have found evidence for them existing both on Maui and Oahu. And I said that I was real pleased with myself that I found these aquifers here on Hualalai. But then after a while, I realized that my instructor, Gordon McDonald, had reported evidence of similar groundwater aquifers on Maui. And I went back and looked at the geology and groundwater resources of Maui, and very clearly he drilled through very similar structures over there. Does it mean that we have vast groundwater resources available on the other islands? Not necessarily. Again, we don't really know as much as we need to know. We don't fully understand why these structures form or how extensive they are. There's a lot more we have yet to learn. But it's very clear they're important to how groundwater is stored and how it moves inside the island. So my take-home message, a lot of what we thought we knew about Hawaii groundwater systems is wrong. There's more that, and in my opinion, there's more we don't know about our groundwater than what we actually do know. There's a heck of a lot yet to learn. And I guess, my other message is we need to spend less time fighting over groundwater and more time studying. Said like a card-carrying academic, I know, but bottom line is the better we understand how the groundwater moves and is stored inside the island, the better we can manage a resource that's critical to the ability of future generations to survive and adapt to future challenges here in Hawaii. If anybody's going to be affected by climate change, guarantee you Hawaii will be. And with that, thank you, and I'm done. I'd be happy to answer questions, and sorry I ran over.
Dr. Thomas, thank you so much for this very informative presentation. We are at 5 o'clock, but if you're willing to stay over just
Absolutely.
to address questions of folks who have questions, that'll be great. And I will open it up to the group. Folks, those who need to leave, feel free to do so. Don't feel obligated. But I know some of you have questions, so kindly stay, and we'll get those questions addressed.
Yeah, I posted a question in the chat regarding the temperature of the deep aquifers, the water temperature.
Mm-hmm. Let's see.
Do we have data on that?
Let's see. Let me see. I'm not actually able to see.
So the question, Dr. Thomas, is what is the temperature of the fresh water?
Okay, the fresh water in the saddle is about 25 to 30 degrees Celsius, about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So it is warm, and we do see some effect from the deep hydrothermal system, but the water quality is still certainly adequate for drinking water.
Great, thanks. Another question is the situation. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm more interested in the ones in Kulalai.
Kulalai. Oh, okay. They're like 68 degrees Fahrenheit, between 68 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Thomas, what about the situation further north, like in the really arid locations, North Kohala? What is the situation there?
Well, in honesty, it's kind of unknown. We haven't had an opportunity to really do any kind of deep drilling and deep exploration up there. There's still a lot to do. And, as I mentioned, we're seeing water, submarine seeps in quite deep ocean on the ocean floor, about 10 kilometers offshore. And that says that, it's very likely that we do have some confined aquifers beneath that region. Because the only way we're going to get water that far, fresh water that far offshore, is if there are some more buried aquifers in that area. But we haven't done any drilling up there. We haven't had an opportunity to do any geophysics to really try to characterize what that area looks like.
Question from Paul. Are there any implications of your work for procuring more geothermal generation?
Well, to me, it's abundantly clear that we have lots more geothermal resource than exists just in Lower Puna. We are, in my opinion, at least I would say, the evidence is that we're not resource limited by any means. The again, my opinion, we are more limited by the regulatory morass that surrounds geothermal development than we are by any inherent limitation to the resource. There's a lot more we could do in geophysical surveys. We've done a few surveys over on the flanks of Mauna Loa. There's at least moderate evidence that there are high temperatures there as well. So the saddle does appear to be a more or less unexplored region. But again, the regulatory environment is so adverse, and there is such a strong mentality of no geothermal, and I'll be blunt, pandering to obstructionists, that it's really not an attractive environment for somebody to invest $20 million in coming in and trying to prove up those resources.
Richard has a question, and Richard, maybe you can expand on this. How many more wells would you need to answer your questions? Presumably, there are still unanswered questions, and absolutely there must be.
Oh yeah, many. I mean, I would love to have an opportunity to drill in the North Kohala region, and drill one or two wells there. I've only just recently become aware of to me, kind of a thunderbolt that I've really misinterpreted the geology over there. It turns out that Hualalai extends much further to the north than I'd realized. And in thinking about sort of a nebulous kind of conceptual model nonetheless, is that Hualalai may in fact be serving as a blocking mechanism for flow coming from Mauna Kea heading out to the west. And that Hualalai may in fact be responsible for some of that high level water that we're seeing in the west flank of the saddle. So that's something that I would like to, have an opportunity to do more exploration. And, to me, it's unfortunate at best that, the Seaworm guys drilled the Koloko deep monitoring well. They did it with rotary drilling. And that meant that, we're no closer to really understanding what the fundamental confining layer is that is responsible for that large freshwater aquifer. When you're rotary drilling, if there's a big ash layer there, it just flushes away. You never see it. And so that's, I really would like to have an opportunity to drill there and see if we can identify what those layers are. And that will tell us something about maybe how extensive they are. But
I have one. Thank you.
Go ahead.
So one question I do have here in the chat is related to cesspools, and based on what you described, these water tables are multi-layer and really deep, and when you talk about 2,000-year-old water flowing from above, it's fairly amazing. But it does seem like those might be sheltered from the impact of cesspools. But I'm just curious, are these findings going to influence how we prioritize our deprecation of all these cesspools around the state, around the island?
Well, again, it's yes. I mean, the short answer, yes. These deeper aquifers are protected to some degree, and I guess to a degree that's maybe good news. Although, I also have to say that we've got 55,000 cesspools on the Big Island. And some of these aquifers, I have argued for decades that have the best water quality in the world. Why do we want to degrade that water quality of the cesspool? But it is true that the structure of the aquifers that we have tends to protect the deeper water from shallow contamination as you approach the shoreline. But again, you do have to pay attention to where the water that you're drawing is coming from, and whether there are good barriers that separate the sort of degraded water from the better quality below, water quality below.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. We're 10 minutes past. I'd like to. Does anyone have any other questions that they would like to raise? Jerry.
Yeah, Don. The lack of water in Kona is hindering a lot of developments that would otherwise be going forward. The Federal Parks Division has protested any more well drilling in Kona because of the salinity, I guess, of the aquifer.
Yeah.
Does your study overshadow their thoughts?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll as long as we're among friends, I'll be blunt. I think the national parks claims are a fairy story, and I think they know it. I've told them that. This deeper aquifer is connected to the high level aquifer. The USGS doesn't like me much because they have conjured up a conceptual model that is one that the Park Service likes. But I think there is so much evidence that that model is incorrect. And when I say that model, that their claim is that the high level aquifer, all of that water has to pass through the basal aquifer in order to get to the ocean, and any withdrawal of water from that high level aquifer is depleting the water that is going through the basal aquifer. And this is a perfect example of sort of how these divergent models relate to our water use. As far as I'm concerned, wells drilled down at intermediate elevations, similar to the Keopu well or the Kamakana well or the Koloko deep monitoring well, the Department of Water Supply could drill down there into that deep aquifer, probably cut their pumping costs and annual maintenance costs in half, and draw exclusively from that deep aquifer and allow full restoration of natural flow through the basal aquifer. And they would never impact the volume of water passing through the basal aquifer. So natural conditions could be restored. But withdrawal, as far as I'm concerned, withdrawal of water from that high-level aquifer or from the deep aquifer will have a negligible impact on the basal aquifer.
How can we get your message to them?
Well, I've delivered it to them multiple times, and they refuse to hear it. And
so you think our congressional delegation might help?
I'd be happy to talk with them and brief them on this. I mean, this is one of the things I like to tell people, I don't have a dog in this fight. Okay. I don't do any consulting. All I want is to get accurate information to the people that make the decisions. And, it is my best professional opinion that withdrawal of water from that deep aquifer has no impact on the Yankee line ponds. And I'll be brutally honest that, I think the Park Service just wants to take control of the groundwater access to the aquifer in Kona so that they can control any further development there.
Could you explain what CWRM stands for?
It's a Commission on Water Resources Management. CWRM. That their nickname is CWRM.
Are they federal or state?
No, that's state. It's they're under DLNR, Department of Land and Natural Resources, and this goes back to the 80s or 90s when the Water Commission is sort of the short version of their name. The Water Commission was established to regulate groundwater use and withdrawal throughout the state. And of course, I've presented all of this. I work pretty closely with the Water Commission staff, and whatever data and interpretations I have, I provide to them, and so they are well aware of sort of the difference of opinion on the Keho aquifer between myself and the national park. And actually, I am working with actually the Natural Energy Lab has requested some funding or will request some funding in their new budget to allow us to do some more of these offshore surveys. The offshore surveys are cheaper than drilling. And so if we can do some offshore surveys sort of in their area, some additional ones that look deeper, then, if we find a deep, a significant deep freshwater aquifer, then they will get the money to drill over there, and that will sort of prove up that deep nearshore aquifer so that others would be able to also access that system.
Perfect. I think Kanani has a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Aloha, Dr. Thomas.
Aloha.
Thank you so much for your amazing research. I've been following since 2006 with Kona Water Roundtable.
Mm-hmm.
And indeed, when I left water supply in 2015, I didn't get to follow the research as it continued, but I do understand that the designation of the aquifer that was filed by the National Park Service at the Commission on Water Resource Management was not pursued, correct? That it was not allowed to continue.
That's correct. That's correct.
What was it that you have surmised as a result of all of that community outreach that happened around Kona Water Roundtable to really understand the way that water flows in our island has not ever been understood before?
Well, this, and unfortunately, what's happened too, and I'm summarizing some of my work, and there are some other folks. We got some funding, and actually there's been that offshore survey work was supported by National Science Foundation funding. And there's two graduate students who are both local young women who are completing a PhD, and they are doing a bunch more of the chemistry and isotope analyses and age dating on these water from these wells that are over there. And so we are trying to add to the sort of body of knowledge to understand sort of that whole system. And certainly, getting out to the public and informing everyone, what our findings are is a significant part of that. And I've done a couple of Pau Hanas that they've held over at Nelha to talk about this. I'm probably overdue to do some more, but really would like to get these two young women, completed with their work so that I can also present some of their findings, and again, sort of add to that body of knowledge. I mean, I like to say that, if I could find that magic reset button and start my career all over again, I could probably spend, another 40 years working on Hawaii's groundwater hydrology and still wish I knew more. There's a lot to do yet. And I've tried to add to the body of knowledge, but there's an awful lot more that we need to do.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. It seems like the presumption of the designation was to stop all development based on the peaks of Hualalai and the low parts of Hualalai as the only boundaries of the aquifer. But that's not the case because the water is permeating from the isotopic signatures from high up on Mauna Loa all the way discharging to beyond Hualalai.
Yes. Yeah.
Shoreline.
Yes. And I've had some discussions with the folks at the Water Commission. They would like me to, at some point, if we can ever get out of this COVID restriction, to do a presentation for the Water Commission itself to sort of kind of bring them up to speed on what the science is telling them and encourage them to begin thinking about sort of taking steps to integrate these findings into how they manage the water. The current management process is, the best term I can think of is naive. These different aquifer sectors are drawn on the basis of surface geology, but we all know that the underlying geology is what counts, and the underlying geology, the surface geology tells us almost nothing about the underlying geology. So, we really have to do a better job of understanding sort of these structures and use that knowledge to understand how water is flowing.
Thank you so much for this time and for the insights and knowledge and the truths that you've shared tonight. I just wanted to just add in closing that as we start to experience the consequences of the changing climate, we're going to see water shortages, et cetera. Knowing that we have this wealth beneath our feet, right? We just need to know where to look and how to get at it. Is a very positive thing. It's there. We need to understand how to leverage it and do it in a proactive way. So we're not waiting until the last moment to realize, wait a minute, what are we going to do now, right? So
Exactly.
thank you so much for this insight.
Well, my pleasure. I enjoyed talking with you.
Team,
certainly,
yeah, we look forward to having you again. If there are any other questions, I'm sure that Dr. Thomas will be happy to field them. We'll just do it offline. And really appreciate everyone sticking around, sharing the questions, and hopefully we'll have another opportunity. Thank you again.
Yes. Thank you. Fascinating.
Thank you. My pleasure. My pleasure.
Aloha,
Thanks,
everybody.
Aloha.
See you, Don.
Thank you.
Take care.
Aloha. Have a good weekend.
You too.